All right. So, hey, please welcome to the show, Michael Thomas Perone. Hey, Michael, how are you?
All right. Thanks for having me.
Hey, it's my
Appreciate
pleasure.
it.
Whenever we have guests on, and certainly on our regular podcast, I like to mention how we like to talk about how certainly look back nostalgically at the 1980s, but so much of it is still around or influencing artists like yourself and beyond. Based on my reading about you, you grew up in the 1980s, but folks younger than us, are still keeping it alive, and so it's fantastic to talk to you about your book, which is set in the 1980s, Danger Peak.
Mhm.
So I guess threshold question, and again, I noted I do know you grew up in the 1980s, but why set a book in the 1980s?
That's a good question. Originally, actually, it wasn't set in any time. It was just
Okay,
universal. It was just any time. But so much of the book is a love letter to my childhood, but also trying to reconcile the tragedy at the center of it. That every time I wanted to make a reference to a movie or a TV show or a song, I had the 80s on the brain. And at first, I thought it was a little cheesy. I was like, no, maybe not do that. But end up making the book better as I read it back. It was like more fully realized, lived in world. And I often tell people, if I grew up in the '60s, my book would be filled with references to the Beatles, Bell Bombs, and Woodstock. And instead, it's
yep,
filled with references to Star Wars, Transformers, Ghostbusters, and the falling of the Berlin Wall.
right. Yeah, I thought
no,
it was fantastic. Sort of just as one of the many sort of plugs for your book, because I think it's well done,
thank you.
is how you insert those in a way that doesn't seem gratuitous.
Yeah,
Like you
that was by
cleverly.
design.
Oh, that's what I want to ask you. Like, how do you avoid the trap of, making it seem like, hey, 1980s, here we are again.
Yeah,
Remember?
it's tricky. I don't know. I don't want to name specific examples. Sometimes you're watching something and they just throw in an 80s reference and it has nothing to do with the plot and has nothing to do with
Right.
anything else. And you're just like, okay, yeah, we get it. It's the 80s. So I didn't want to do that. For people who haven't read the book, I don't want them to think I just go, Star Wars, Indiana Jones, He-Man, Ghostbusters, period, the end. Enjoy it, the story,
Yeah.
everybody. I tried to incorporate the references organically to the story. So, I mean, I don't know if you read the entire book yet, but I'm kind of giving away something of the plot, but the boys are trying to build this superpowered motorbike so they can climb the supernatural mountain, Danger Peak, that killed the main character's brother the year before.
Sure.
And one of the enhancements they have is a thing called a turbocharger, and it makes the
Mhm.
bike go really fast, but only for a short period of time. And they get the idea from Knight Rider. I remember that show. It was,
Oh my goodness,
they had
yes.
the turbo boost button. And I was a kid, I used to watch that show all the time. I was always thinking, like, why don't they use that button at the start of the chase? So he always waits until the last second before he does it.
Yes.
But the episodes would be half as long, so it makes sense from a
Yeah.
production standpoint. But when you're a kid, you're like, let's just get to the fireworks factory and just push that button. And whenever you did it, and then the car would go off, I was like, yay! It was just the best
Yeah.
when you're a kid. So I had a little homage to that in my book. That's just
Yeah.
one example.
Yes. And I don't think you're giving too much away because fairly early that's established. Although
Yeah,
one thing you said, and I'll cut this out if you want me to, is that I noticed that you said it's a supernatural mountain. And later on, certainly at the end of the book, it reminded me of a section of Life is Pi. There's certain chapters in Life is Pi where it's like, did this really happen? Now, I don't know if you read Life is Pi or saw the movie. There's a question of whether the whole story actually happened. But there's this really
mm.
bizarre section in the middle where it's like, maybe the storyteller was just trying to make a metaphor for something because it was too bizarre what happened. Um, so again, maybe this is giving too much away. Maybe let's scrap that. We should probably cut that. That's giving too much away, I
Okay.
think. Right? I mean, when he gets
I'll
to the
give you
mountain,
my
and
answer if you want.
okay, go ahead.
I think I know what the answer is, but
Yeah,
when I was just a consumer of entertainment, and I realize the frustration some people might have, like, just tell me what it is, just tell me what the thing is,
hmm,
and I don't want to say this is what it is. I'm
right.
open to interpretation. You can say it could be one of two things. If you've read the whole book, and it seems like you have,
I've got
it
my
can be one of two
interpretation.
things. Excuse me.
I've got my interpretation, and I think mine
Okay.
is right.
Of course it is,
Yeah,
and that's why you don't want to ruin it for people. Say
yeah,
if I say it's X, people are like, no, I thought it was Y. Well, screw this then.
yeah.
It's kind of like the ending to Labyrinth. It's one of my favorite movies, and I'm
Hmm.
sure you've seen it, where
Yeah,
it's like, did it happen? Did it not happen?
right.
When I was a kid, it was like my least favorite part of the movie. It's like I didn't. It's like, wait a minute, she was fighting these creatures, and now they're in her bed, and what's going on? I was like, oh, I kind of get it. It's just coming of
Mm,
age metaphor. So yeah, I mean, that's all I'll say about the ending.
yeah,
It can go one or two ways, and I won't begrudge you
Yeah.
for whatever interpretation you have, but I kind of like that it's open to
Right.
interpretation. But I do have my answer. That's all.
Dang it. And I wish I had said Labyrinth instead of Life of Pi. I'm not host of an 80s show. I should have.
Yeah, I was
Should
just
be
gonna
thinking
say
of
I've
me.
never seen Life of Pi. I'm sorry.
Damn it.
You,
You
I'm
don't
wearing a
have to
green
see
shirt.
it.
I know Labyrinth.
Yeah.
Stick to my wheelhouse.
Damn it. My wheelhouse, too. I can fit in that wheelhouse. There's plenty of space. All right. Well, okay. So, I noticed already that when talking about telling the Knight Rider story, I mean, what you said and how you felt about it, that's straight in, I don't want to say it's Robert's mouth. I think it's someone else who says it. Maybe it's Chris.
His brother.
Oh, it's Dan. Okay. Danny says it. So how much of these characters are based on you and your friends and family?
It's fairly close. I mean, I guess it's kind of obvious,
Okay.
but it's not exact,
Sure.
exactly like, stamped like this is that. And you try to exaggerate and make it more entertaining for the reader. So obviously Robert is like a very, very brave version of myself. I would never climb the Angel Peak. I would just not have the guts. I have never even been on a motorbike before. So
Okay.
I've been on bicycles. Obviously, I figured motorbikes would be more interesting for the reader, instead of kids riding around on bicycles. But a lot of the book, it's inspired by my adventures. They weren't as fantastical as this, obviously, but my adventures riding around with my two best friends around town in the 80s on our bikes. And I think you used to say when you were a kid in Ohio, you ride your bike into an abandoned factory, and for you, it was like going through the Death Star, the trench.
Yeah,
We kind of did stuff
right.
like that. We had abandoned elementary schools because there weren't, Generation X was the baby bus, so there were no kids. So we had 2 elementary schools that were empty. We'd ride our bikes around, it'd be hills. And so I use my imagination that way. The teacher, Dr. Howard, he's very, very loosely based on a music teacher I had in high school who would get very upset if you called him Mr. He wanted to be called Doctor. All he had was a doctor in music. So, doctorate in music. So, if someone was having a heart attack in class, he would still call 911. He would not know how to resuscitate this person. But so I thought when I was a kid, that's really annoying. That's annoying right now. But one day it's going to be funny. And years later, when I was trying to think of a quirk for this guy, I'm making this kind of as he's a quasi villain. I try not to make him too cartoonish. He does have a soft spot in his heart for the boys at the end. He sort of reconciles slightly with them towards the end of the book. But so that's him. Obviously, Danny, the brother, is based on my brother who passed away in March of 1986 from a brain tumor.
So sorry
obviously a
about that.
supernatural mountain. But he's I made him. He was 12 when he passed away. He was I made Danny 17. I made him older just because why. I'm just answering my own question. Like, why did I make him older? Because I always looked up my brother as he was 4 years older than me as like this really strong. He seemed to know what he was doing. Like I looked up to him, so he did seem like a teenager, like an old dude, but he wasn't. He died. He passed away when he was 12. But in my mind, he was 17. He was a cool guy. He was like the Han Solo of my Luke Skywalker.
Yeah,
and that's also based in the book. All those Star Wars sleepovers, that's all based on. We used to have I used to go in his bed. It was our military with the sheets over our head. And I wanted to be Han Solo, and like, no, I'm older. I'm Han Solo. It's like, he had a good reasoning for that because he was older, but he's the cooler character I want to be in, but he never let me be in. And then we would strap on jet packs and go downstairs Saturday mornings and eat cereal and watch cartoons. So that was all a tribute to my brother, especially when you get to that. Well, I'm getting too much away.
Yeah, I know, it's too tricky.
Who else? Oh yeah, Brittany. Is based on my best friend. I exaggerated him probably too much. He's a little bit too cartoonish. And when I read the book back, I'm like, it's a little bit too cartoony, but I wanted a comic relief, and he's an obvious comic relief.
Sure.
And Chris is based on my friend Joe, or I should say childhood friend Joe. We kind of lost touch, but he was always bantering with Rennie, and I was always getting in between them. They always had like this friendly rivalry between each other, and I put that in the book. And so I'll stop there. But yes, the answer took the long-winded answer. Yes,
no, that's I mean, look, I don't know that you can. You obviously. Hey, you're a writer. You write things. I don't think it's possible for an author to escape writing for themselves. They said that even with artists, essentially, some aspect of them is painted into that art. I mean, it's inevitable. So,
yeah. Anyone who says that, any writer who says that, the main character has nothing to do with them, they're lying. There's something in that main character, some type of personality quirk that you identify with. Otherwise, why would you make him the main character?
Right. So, Look, folks, early on, this isn't giving anything away. Obviously, like sadly you experienced in your life, the main character is mourning the loss of his older brother, and for him, it becomes this, honor conquering danger peak as a way of dealing with that, paying honor to his brother. At what point did you start writing the book based on your experience with your own brother?
Well, the book is based on a story I wrote in 1988 when I was 11 years old. So now you know how old I am. But it was short. It was 30, 35 pages. There wasn't much to it. Didn't have all these subplots and stuff. And the ending was different. But I always knew, or always wanted to write the full-length novel version of this book. I always thought, that the story was good enough that it should be a book. And decades went on, I didn't do it. So when am I going to do it? When am I going to do it? And I don't want to get too personal, but something happened in 2018. I'm like, okay, I thought that the world was ending. I was like, you know what? That's it. I'm writing this book because who knows how long, and I should know more than anyone, who knows how long we have on this earth.
Right.
And I thought it was an impossible task. I'm not a, this is going to sound bad, but I'm not really a big book reader. I mean, I'm more of a, movie guy, which is why the book seems so cinematic in my opinion.
Yep.
And, but it came out in 3 months, 4 months, I was done. I mean, the first draft, obviously not the finished draft.
Sure.
I just couldn't stop writing. And I was like, I had this thing bubbling up inside me for decades. I was like, why? I should have done this sooner, especially when, the 80s stuff was really coming out, for, more than I do, a few years ago, like when Stranger Things first came out. That's when the book should have come out. But, I waited too long. And I tell, other writers, like, don't wait. Write it down. It's therapeutic. Get this out.
Right. Yeah, I don't think you missed the mark. It seems to me, and just a couple of years into this podcast, I was like, how much longer can we do this? I mean, obviously there's folks at our age that like
it's only
culture,
10 years.
Right.
Just like any other decade.
But it seems like more. There's more coming now. There's more coming. And books like yourself included.
Today, while we're recording this, a new Indiana, probably less, when the new Indiana Jones movie comes out today.
Right.
That's
exactly
crazy. Yep. And he's a huge influence. Those movies are a huge influence. If you read the book, it's mentioned, Raiders of the Lost Ark is mentioned several times.
Yes. Yeah. And there's certainly moments throughout the book, and to your point about it being cinematic, where it felt like various 80s movies. It's inevitable. I mean, and maybe it's just because you draw on your experiences in your youth, and I lived that, it's around the same time period. So even if it was by accident, it is cinematic. I agree with you, because there's so many moments where it's like, oh, this feels like this, or like, and there's, I won't be specific, but there's a moment where I guess I can say it. There's a moment where Dr. Howard shows up, and I was like, oh, this is Cross of Coronado, or Last Crusade, where you have something of mine.
That's a great. I didn't even think that might have been subliminal.
Yeah,
that's a very good reference. That's insightful. I know why you do what you do. You're good at this
because it's all I think about.
I didn't even think to make that connection until now, but you're probably right.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're probably right. I had that in the back of my mind when I was writing that scene. I know what scene you're referring to.
Yeah, and it's great because it, like I said about the 80s references generally, it's not something that it seems contrived. It seems earned. All these moments just feel like, so familiar and nostalgic in a way that, again, it's not overplayed, and it's just sort of because of the sort of semiotics of it, I think. So you could say these certain phrases, and I bring all this stuff from my 80s experience like yours, and these films, it feels comfortable and, familiar. And much like yourself, I didn't ride. I think I rode a dirt bike once in my entire life, and it was during my youth. But mostly, it was driving around on BMXs, which were so freeing. It was might as well like get your driver's license when you were a kid, because, like you're saying, in the 80s, and we weren't policed that much. It was like parents didn't realize how far we would drive on these bikes.
No.
So you never rode
Sometimes
a bike.
Be pissed too. Like,
yeah, exactly. I know. I remember going to like a city limit, and I was like, I'm going to go over this border here.
You're braver than me. I didn't go that far.
Oh, is that right?
I would cross. The worst I did was I crossed a highway. It's called Sunrise Highway by where I live. It's a very busy highway.
Right.
A lot of deaths on that highway.
Oh, gosh.
Just to get to the stationery store. I desperately wanted to get to that store. I wanted to buy Garbage Pail Kids or something. I'll risk my life, for Fatty Patty or whatever the name of that card was.
I love that the protagonist in your book is life and limb to get these parts for his bike, and you're going for Garbage Pail Kids. That's funny.
You have to make it more fantastical. To make it more interesting for the reader.
So does that mean that in your area there wasn't a danger peak of sorts? Was there something
No,
like that?
I live on Long Island. We're flat as a pancake. We don't have any mountains. We have, I think, garbage mountains. I think they dump a lot of,
But was there, I guess more metaphorically, I mean, like I remember when I was a kid, down the street from mine, I grew up in Jersey City, New Jersey before I moved out here. I've lived here for 20 years now.
Oh,
But
that's right. I said Ohio before. I forgot.
oh, that's okay. Yeah, I've lived here for, I'm started to say, to my wife's great joy, I've now started, when people ask us, where are you from? I've been saying Ohio. For years, I say, I'm from New Jersey. Yeah, I lived in Ohio for 20 years. I'm not from there. But where I am from, or grew up in Jersey City, there was this thing we called the suicide down the street from me. And what it was is there was a bridge on our street that spanned a lower street rather. That was it was kind of this, the road would curve around and go under itself and then lead to a lower area of our city. And the suicide was if you would go on the outside of this bridge along the fence and, just maneuver yourself along this little strip of concrete and asphalt holding onto the chain link to get from one side over the other, eventually being suspended over the road, And so that was our danger peak. I never did it because I was always a kid that was like you. I'm like,
I would never do it.
No, I live by, I don't want to be on the news. If this is something my parents would see on the news and they'd be pissed.
Still here today, so you did something right.
Exactly. So there wasn't anything like that. There wasn't the danger peak or suicide in your neighborhood the kids were doing.
You brought up before, it's kind of like a metaphor, like climb every mountain. There's literally a mountain in my book, a supernatural mountain, in fact. But I know it seemed, also, I should have mentioned this before. One of the inspirations for the book is this old school 8-bit Nintendo game called Excite Bike. I don't know if you remember that, but it was one of those programmable games where you could make the course any way you want. So one day when I was a kid, I made this ramp really big and looked like a mountain, and my bike was going up that mountain. I said, well, that's an interesting image. And I started thinking, well, what would be on top of that mountain? So that was the germ of the idea for the book. And that's when I wrote the short story book version of the book.
Gotcha.
I should have mentioned that
before. It's Rennie who plays Excite Bike, I think, throughout the
Yeah, I had to put that in. It's like, that's probably like an inside joke just for me, people who know the inspiration behind the book.
Well, it ties well together too, though, because I think it's certainly at that time, as a kid who's doing these bikes, you would be drawing those connections, So I think it works. And I thought it was interesting that they're trying to build this bike to help him get up the mountain, and in much the way that Excite Bike, like you're saying, is a way you can customize these, maps essentially.
Yeah, so kind of. Actually, I didn't even think of that now until just now too. That's another all this stuff that you do when you're riding. You're not thinking I'm going to do it because of this. Yeah. It's all subliminal. It's like a soup. This. We're living in the pop culture soup, and it just goes through your brain, through your fingers, and you type it out, and people like you pick up on things that I didn't even know, and I wrote the damn thing. It's really insightful points you're making.
It reminds me of in high school, a professor saying, sometimes our English professor, sometimes the curtains are just blue because they're blue. Because, you'd have another teacher. Another teacher's like, the curtains are blue because he's sad about his wife is cheating on him. Like, he just made blue curtains. The author wanted to use an adjective.
It's pretty.
Yeah. And I think if you are thinking those things, the book's probably not going to be as, to seem as organic as
you don't want to overthink it.
Yeah. So you based Chris and Rennie on two friends, and you said Rennie maybe you've gone a little over the top. And But have the real life Chris and Rennie read the book, and what did they think about their portrayals of their?
The real life Rennie has. He liked it. Maybe he was probably a little sore that I made him so much of a wuss. He's not like that anymore. He's probably tougher now than I am. But like when we were growing up, I just remember he was whining about everything. It's like, oh, shut up, Rennie. I'm not gonna say his real name, but it's like enough of that. Like I said before, unfortunately, I lost touch with the guy who's based on Chris.
Oh, you did. Okay, I didn't mention.
But weird side notes. I'm friends with his sister on Facebook. And we got in touch together because I knew his birthday was coming up. I was like, maybe if you're running out of things, you don't know what to get him for his birthday, you might want to pick up my book because there's a character in there that's based on him. So she's like, oh, thank you so much. And she's like, you have to sign it. And I was like, it's a little cheesy. I don't want. She said, no, we have to meet and sign. So she made me come out and sign it. And so presumably he got the book. I don't know. I haven't heard from him. I wrote dangerpeak.com on the inside cover in case he wants to get in touch with me. Haven't heard from him. I guess, he didn't like the book. Maybe he didn't like my portrayal of him, but I thought he comes out pretty well compared to Rennie. He's heroic compared to Rennie. So I wouldn't mind being Chris, but I haven't heard from him. Maybe if
Yeah,
he
that'd be
sees this
fun.
podcast.
Oh, I think you were gonna say maybe you'll see you get a lawsuit in the mail, getting subpoenaed because of you suing over his portrayal. Just kidding, that's not gonna happen. No, I agree. Yeah, and that's the other thing is everybody, and I don't think you had to grow up in the '80s, but maybe it's the circumstances that make it seem like that to me. Was that everybody knew a Chris and a Rennie? Everybody. We had our friend groups, and we all had our sort of archetypes or
Wise
tropes,
ass.
and yeah, exactly. Yes.
Yeah, I don't know. If I can curse. I can pretty sure I've listened to your podcast, but I can curse. I'll curse.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm trying to think. Maybe I think I would have been a blend of a Chris and a Rennie. Like you said, a little more cautious about things, dumb about some things, a smart ass about other things. Oh, I'll throw Robert in there too. So, and this may be too personal, and you don't have to answer. We can talk about something else. But you mentioned obviously that your brother had passed away, and I can't help but, and I know this. I'm saying something so obvious, right? But it does seem like Danger Peak for you was writing the book. Like you said, it seemed impossible. It's something impossible. You wound up turning it out in 3 months. And so I guess what I'm asking now is, in the way that Robert, without giving away, feels the compulsion to conquer this mountain, and it seems like, obviously, I think from the very beginning, you think, well, it's connected to his brother. Did writing the book help at all with some closure with your own brother?
You're gonna make me cry with these questions.
Oh gosh, dang it! I'm sorry. All right, we can skip it.
Man, you hit the nail on the head. You're 100% right. That's why. That's one of the reasons why I pushed myself. It's like, when the hell am I going to write this book? It's like the book. I mean, I'll show you. You already know, but the book is a tribute to my brother. I mean, if you look, the first thing you see at the title page, it's for Stephen. That's why I wanted to do it. I wanted a record of it out in the world. I wanted our story out there in the world. But absolutely, it's I wanted to pay tribute to my brother because I loved him.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's a fantastic tribute. Obviously, as you mentioned, Danny's cast a little bit older, but certainly the love and respect and admiration you have for your brother comes out in the book as well. What are you working on now? And do you think, and is it possible it might be revisiting the 80s?
It is revisiting the 80s. It's also kind of burying the 80s, both literally and figuratively. It's kind of weird. I'll say this: it's not Danger Peak 2. Everyone wants a Danger Peak 2. It's not going to be that. I'm not one of those writers who's like, oh, Danger Peak 2, Electric Boogaloo, Danger Peak 3. It's like, what are they up to now in 2050?
And even taller mounted. It's 3 miles tall.
Imagine now there's laser beams striking on the top of the mountain.
Now the mountain learned, so it has the opposite things it needs without saying anything.
I don't want to put down other indie writers like myself, but I read about indie writer blogs and stuff, and I was like, okay, part 12 of my magical children's story. It's like, how many times are you gonna read about these children? No, my next book is gonna be a little different, a little darker. It's, how do I explain this without giving too much away? Well, the first book, obviously, we talked about this. It was more or less about the death of my brother. The new book's going to be about the death of childhood, so it's going to be much larger in scope. It's going to be a little bit longer. It's going to take place over a longer period of time. So I'm not counting the epilogue. Danger Peak, I think, is only 2 weeks time. And this book is going to be taking place over the last year of the 80s and then a little bit of the 90s, and there's a reason for that. I'll just give you a little bit of the story. It's main character's name is Bobby Dalton. He doesn't want to grow up. It's kind of based on me. I'm Peter Pan, did not want to grow up. And
he says wearing a Goonies t-shirt.
Could you? Did I give too much away? But he's something similar. I'll say the Danger Peak. He has 2 best friends, but they're not they're kind of different characteristics though. And they, they're thick as thieves in the 80s. They play imaginary games. They're children. But then as soon as the 80s become the 90s, they turn 13. They enter junior high. They start separating from each other. They start, joining different cliques. And this is based on, what happened to me. And so out of desperation, the main character, Bobby, he convinces his 2 other friends to bury this time capsule to commemorate the end of the 80s, put their favorite things from the 80s into this time capsule. And they don't want to do it, but they finally give in. They feel bad because he's kind of like being an outcast. They do that, and then something supernatural happens. And I'm not going to give away what it is, but the book at that point, at the halfway point, goes crazy. Like, my beta readers are saying, I think you went a little bit too far. I had to dial it back a little. But it's crazier than Danger Peak, and I'll just say it's darker, and at the end it gets a little violent. But it has to be. It's about growing up. That's what got
Wow. Even by that elevator pitch, I love it. I cannot wait to read this. This is fascinating to me.
I'm trying for a Christmas release. I don't think I'll make it
though,
but it's the first draft is done, but I'm polishing it up now before I submit it.
Very good. Yeah. You hit upon a couple of things I wanted to mention. Before I'd say that, as a side note, maybe I won't even add this in the show. My wife reads these, she always read nonfiction, but she started reading fiction recently, and she tells me these stories that she's reading. I'm like, how is that a book? Because literally it'll be like you're saying, where like partway through the story, it flips. Like some book she was reading 3 chapters in, this whole story, it turns out that was a dream. And then it's half the book. Half the book is a dream.
No, I wouldn't do that.
I hope not. And then there was some other thing. It's like by the end of the book, like magic exists. It's like it wasn't in 7 3/4. But the way she describes them, though, it's this fascinating and fantastic element of storytelling that I'm not familiar with, but works. And the way you described it, I'm interested. How yours seems to sort of play with that.
Thank you. It's almost like it flips genres. The book halfway through, a little bit over, more than halfway through, but it also the second half of the book, the crazy part of the book, kind of reflects on the first part, and vice versa. There's connection there. It's not just completely random and it has nothing to do with it. The reason why the stuff's going crazy is because of what happened in the first half. And one of the comments I'm getting from my beta readers is like, it's taking too long to get to this stuff. And when we get into the fireworks factory, it's like, so I cut a chapter completely. It doesn't really come up, so there's no point to have it there. And I also chopped out some parts of other chapters, but I'm trying to get to the fireworks factory quicker.
Gotcha. I love that metaphor you keep bringing up. So back to the book. So you said a couple things you're talking reference. About. Oh, is that what? Okay. Oh, Simpsons, yeah. That's the what was it?
Simpsons.
Yeah, Simpsons. I was going to say Futurama, but Simpsons. Yeah, right.
Cartoons. How are they going to get to the fireworks factory?
Right. Yeah. And then wasn't it in the Simpsons? Well, I'm getting off topic. Okay, so and you're talking about your new book. You remind me of a couple of things that I really dug about your about Danger Peak, and also just makes me remember certain things in my life. Was this notion of that Robert is going through, and I think one of the things he's struggling with his brother, because they're 4 years difference in age, is that period of time of going from 12 to 13. And I had a cousin.
Yes.
This reminded me of my relationship with my cousin who was 15. I think he's 2 years older than me. He's 1 or 2 years older. But I remember since Star Wars came out, every time I would see him, because he lived farther away from me, I would bring my Star Wars toys. And that's what we did. Play with our figures and whatever we had, play sets. And then the one summer I went to visit him, and I brought my case, and he had an electric guitar now, and he wanted to play music and show me how he can play, like Eddie Van Halen. And I was like, oh, why? What about the toys? And they were in his closet, and I felt so sad and naive, and left behind.
It's that 1 year. It's only 1 year. I mean, let's do the math. 2, 3, 4, I'll give you 5 or 6 months. I went from. That's why summer of 1989 is my favorite summer. I mean, that's one of the reasons why the book takes place in the United. In great time in summer of 19. It was the last summer I was a child. Then those 5 months, I went from being 12 to 13, elementary school to junior high, being called Mike to being called Perone, to getting compliments, getting rednecks. 5 months. It's like, what that? No one wants to play toys anymore. Like, what the hell is it? People aren't bringing lunch boxes anymore. They're bringing bags.
Yeah.
They're bringing shopping, with their lunch, because it's too cool.
Right. The brown bag. Yeah.
Want to be. I don't know. And I've always been a Peter. And this kind of ties in actually to my first book about my brother dying. I think, he died at a pivotal age. He died at 12. He never got to be a teenager. And he was 4 years older than me, as I said. So when he was 10 and I was 6, I'm like, oh, when I'm 10, I'm going to be like that. When he was 11, I was 7. When I'm 11, I'm going to be like that. When I'm 12, I don't know after 12, I don't know what to be like. He never got to 13.
Oh, wow. Right.
So that was scaring me from growing. It's like, even though I'm obviously on a real level, I knew I was going to literally physically die. I wasn't going to have brain tumor. I was turning 13, but this took years for me to figure this out. But I didn't figure it out back then. Yeah. But I was subconsciously thinking, if I turn 13, it's like a time bomb. I'm going to die, because he didn't make it to 13. Obviously, that didn't happen. I'm still here today. But that's one of the reasons why I was so afraid of growing up, but to almost a ridiculous, bizarre extent. I mean, I was playing with my G.I. Joes at 14, 15 years old. All my friends were going on dates. Little Rennie and Chris were going on dates. I was like, hey, guys, you might no, I don't want to play G.I. Joe.
Yeah. That's interesting because I
Come to
automatically assumed like when you talked about this Peter Pan complex, and I was like, yeah, of course, because anybody who grew up in the 70s and 80s, we all have that, and the reason, well, most of us, and part of the reason, and I've talked about this on the show before, is because we could, and we could because we had the technology to continue to watch the shows we watched, the movies we watched, the music, unlike prior generations where the quality or certain movies were just not available, etc. We could, and so, but now you're telling me there's an even stronger reason for you to do that. Unlike me, I wasn't motivated in that way. Anyway, I don't know. I guess I'm just making an observation. But you reminded me of something about the 12 and 13. Oh, and then the other thing though is that I think it's fascinating. Your new book, you said about it be 89 to 90, and in Danger Peak, it's set at the end of 89. October it starts in 89. There was something about that. And for me, and obviously I host this show about the 80s, but decades, as you know, are a construct. We made it up, just like we made up time, marking time
real.
generally. But there is something about, what is that about that changeover? And then at the time, did you feel like you were observing it? Or is it just only in hindsight that I've said, 80s are good, 90s suck? I mean, did you feel that coming, that looming new decade?
And I've been thinking about this for 33 years, like, and that's, I'm kind of giving away the ending of the book, but it's like, there's a reason why, okay, it's 1990, bookends. That's it, because the curtain comes down, it's 1990 now, done. That's one of the reasons why it takes place in 89. It's, but also, and I mentioned, some people think this is completely irrelevant. I mentioned the falling of the Berlin Wall at the end of 89. But I do that for a couple of reasons. First of all, it actually literally happened in November 1989. But also, we were filled with such hope. Like, God, if the Berlin Wall can come down, anything can happen. So that's why it's a happy ending. Obviously, this book, and for people who haven't read it, and it's I wanted to get a reader, that sense of hope, that renewed optimism. But you're right. Like, I remember, I was actually in Ohio, December '89, because I visited my cousins for Christmas, and I was watching a news report. I don't remember, Tom Brokaw or someone. And they were doing a rundown of the 80s. And I remember I don't remember exactly what he said. I just remember the last line. He said, the 80s, it was definitely a good time to be alive. I remember thinking, he's right. It kind of was. If you take out, at least for two reasons. One, for me personally, if you take out that huge tragedy at the center of the 80s for me, I had a very happy childhood. I love the movies. I love the music. I love, my friends. I love my family. We pretty much got along with each other. So that's, personally for me. But also, on a larger scale, I'm sure people are going to disagree with me, and that's fine. We weren't really in the 80s in any major wars. I mean, it was the Cold War, but it was a Cold War. It wasn't a hot war. Right. And as soon as the 90s, so that's another thing. As soon as the 90s started, the Gulf War started. The real war. And I remember being shocked, like, I didn't think I was going to live during a time of war, because my whole life I never lived during a time of real war, unless you count the Cold War. And, you grow up, you reading about, the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, World War I, World War II, Vietnam War, Korean War. Think of this is in the past. This is decades and decades. Mm-hmm. I'm never going to deal. And then one day we start going to war. I'm like, what is going on? It was like the world was falling apart. That's one of the another inspiration for the war, but inspiration for the next book. But yeah, there's something about that. The music started getting sad. One thing I mentioned is, in '89, like my brain was like turned online. I was really, I'm going to mispronounce this word, but I was attuned to the zeitgeist of music and the movies. And I remember thinking, okay, what's going to be the first major hit in the 80s? And I put this in the next book. And it happened to be Nothing Compares to You by Sinead O'Connor. And I remember thinking, what a funeral-like dirge that song. We went from poppy, Madonna and everything to, I'm not going to sing it, because we don't have the rights, but that song, and how sad and mournful it was. I remember thinking, man, this is really on the nose. I'm going from 12 to 13, I'm the whole list I gave you, and the music is getting really sad. And then less than a year later, grunge. And it's just like, this is not. So I was basically, the long-winded answer to you, the short answer is I was nostalgic for the 80s in January 1990s. And I've been like that ever since.